Men are pigs. Women are equal to men. But women are wonderful. But men are pigs. And women are equal to men. But women are wonderful. But men are pigs. And women are equal to men. But women are wonderful. But men are pigs. And women are equal to men. But women are wonderful. But men are pigs. And women are equal to men. But women are wonderful. But men are pigs. And women are equal to men. But women are wonderful. But men are pigs. And women are equal to men. To men. To men. To men.
HBR Talk with Hannah Wallen. The U.S. population has been in conflict over illegal immigration since the start of the Trump campaign. A number of issues have been raised around the topic, and most of these are starkly divided along the left-right poles of the political spectrum. But there's one aspect of it that seems to be almost universally accepted. That'd be the labels being used to describe the hordes of people caravanning from South American nations to the U.S. border. The purpose of each side's label is to characterize the entire group based on the most likely knee-jerk response to the way it's worded. While each side questions the validity of the other's assertions regarding the demographic makeup of the caravan, neither questions the other's demographic labels or their implications. There are reasonable statements that can be made in objection to the idea of allowing this to be the manner in which immigrants enter the United States. The actual questions being decided are about the rate and scope of immigration the country should allow, by what methods, and within what set of guidelines. What is to our benefit? What rights do U.S. citizens have regarding our nation's sovereignty and our control over our border? What obligations do we, as human beings, have to troubled citizens from other countries? What is the most reasonable and effective means of ensuring adherence to the limitations and methods we decide to use in our handling of immigration? Are we entitled to expect our authorities to vet immigrants individually so that we know which ones have violent criminal histories versus who is actually seeking asylum, or even just a better and safer job market? The discussion that should be happening has been entirely hijacked by political rhetoric, with a lot of meaningless guilt-tripping from the left, and the right responding with fear-mongering instead of calling them on it, because guilt-tripping and fear-mongering are easier ways to influence the public than logic and reason, and the answers to some of those questions are hard to settle. It's not that hard, however, to rip the guilt filter off the existing narratives promoting open borders. We're simultaneously being told that the people of these caravans are from such horrible environments rife with gang violence and political chaos that they must all be considered refugees with legitimate asylum claims, all traveling through nations that are also too horrible to live in, from which they cannot accept the asylum offers many have received, because they would not find safety there either. Of course, none of the nations involved should be called shitholes, because that's racist, and we're not allowed to talk about the fact that criminals from those environments also travel illegally to the U.S., sometimes trafficking their fellow countrymen against their will, because that discussion is racist too. The obvious answer is to stop accepting the label racist as a counterargument to every bit of nuance in the discussion, and instead call it out as the thought-terminating cliche it is. Calling people racist for defending folks who don't want to be exploited as drug mules and slave labor doesn't help the world's vulnerable. The label has no value in the discussion. It is illegitimate, and it should be called out as such every time it is used. There are legitimate points being made in the discussion regarding the effects of mass migration on the economy, the importance of monitoring people's entry and exit from the country, and questioning and criticism of the migrants' choice to bypass that process. The rational end of the existing discussion is being undermined by another tactic, however. The right insists that the caravan is mostly comprised of military-age men. Numerous right-wing commentators have used that exact phrasing to describe all of the various caravans that have approached our border. It's designed to automatically associate the male sex with the concept of an organized, trained fighting force. They are not potential immigrants seeking entry into the country and perhaps even asylum. They are soldiers preparing to invade against the will of the country's citizens, and you'd better pay attention because our country is being invaded right now. You don't want to be taken over by evil, dangerous men from another country, do you? The most reasonable among these commentators add the caveat that they believe most of the migrants are just regular, ordinary citizens looking for a better life. That doesn't qualify them for asylum, but it also doesn't make them dangerous. Only some, we're told, are of ill repute. The commentators then go on to point out the presence of MS-13 gang members and the violent attacks on the borders of each country the caravan has passed through. The fact that some of the people in the most recent caravan had made clear by their actions that their intent was to force their way across the border rather than entering peacefully was heavily emphasized, even though those actions were not committed by all of the travelers. None of the statements made were false, but they are being composed in such a way as to frame the entire group as a violent, gang-led, military-style invasion that every American should fear enough for that idea to overshadow everything else in the debate. Some of that rhetoric should also be easy to break down. The demographic makeup of the caravan does include everything the right has described, but isn't limited to it or necessarily represented by the worst of it. Most importantly, being male doesn't automatically mean military, or gang, or even dangerous. Human trafficking victims come in both sexes, with men largely trafficked for slave labor. In previous episodes of HBR Talk, we highlighted the fact that some men were being forced against their will to act as drug mules as well. There are also men who do have to flee their home nations and seek asylum abroad due to religious or political persecution, or because they become the targets of cartel violence after opposing horrific crimes. There are also legitimate points being made regarding a desperate need for reformation to modernize the immigration process, which is needlessly slow and hard for asylum seekers and other immigrants to navigate. That valid discussion doesn't eliminate the need for border security, but does bear inclusion in the border security debate. Unfortunately, it's being undermined by another tactic also. Rather than emphasize that point or counter the men are dangerous narrative, the left responds instead by labeling the caravans mostly women and children. This one seems a pretty neat trick if you don't mind throwing men under the bus. There is already a tendency among people to view women as harmless and vulnerable, but by tacking on the mention of children, the commentator adds yet another layer of perceived innocence as a weapon against objection to their approach. Combining perception of women with perception of children is a shield against standards and personal boundary enforcement. We give up things for kids and tolerate behavior from kids that we would not in the case of an adult. This label has a history of getting women access to benefits that society normally reserves for children by virtue of being attached as caregivers. What do we hear when there's a rescue underway in the wake of a disaster? Women and children first. Even charity is collected using heartstring-pulling incarnations of the concept. People who just don't have the cash right now to help fund the construction of a local homeless shelter will dig a little deeper to find a few dollars to help out, if it's going to house widows and orphans. When the left uses the label women and children, the listener is being primed to view any objections to their demands as illegitimate due to the harmless, vulnerable, and socially entitled nature of the demographic on whose behalf they claim to argue. The caravan is no longer a mass of foreign people bent on needlessly, willfully ignoring the legal protocol for how to enter the United States. They're society's most vulnerable, entitled to ignore that protocol just because of who they are. And you better not question that, you heartless, sexist bastard. Or maybe it's that you're gutless. After all, what kind of coward is afraid of a bunch of harmless women and children? This rhetoric, obviously, isn't any better than that of the right. As HBR Talk has pointed out numerous times, being female does not make a person harmless. Much of the drug trafficking across the southern border of the U.S. is done by women. There are women in positions of cartel leadership as well, like Sandra Avila Beltran, aka Queen of the Pacific, aka Cocaine Queen, or Melissa La China Calderon, infamous for kidnapping her murder victims from their family homes and returning their dismembered bodies to their doorsteps as a warning to the local community. Most of the world's nations also allow women to enlist in their military forces, some with few or no limitations. How many of the women in this caravan are military age? It would be quite reasonable to ask why, as military-age men are being emphasized, military-age women are never mentioned. It would also be reasonable to ask, what is military age exactly? When discussing nations' official enlistment, that age might be that of adulthood. But when discussing drug cartels and gangs, is that a relevant measure? They begin drafting their warriors at much younger ages, even as young as pre-adolescence, and they're not all male either. Venus Romero Irahita, an MS-13 gang member, stabbed Damaris Alexandra Reyes Rivas 13 times, killing her, then dispassionately confessed the crime in detail to Springfield, Virginia police, all while she was still underage. But hey, what's a little harmless murder between teen girls, am I right? Of course, it does not suit either the guilt-tripping narrative or the fear-mongering narrative to point out the facts that contradict each other's labels and biases. If women are not harmless and men can be unwilling victims of human trafficking, then there is neither guilt in the act of vetting immigrants, nor reason to automatically fear all of them. Nuance in the discussion would have to be addressed. Answers for the most relevant questions would have to be debated. That would be hard and uncomfortable for both sides. It is much easier for politicians and pundits to rely on the age-old tactic of thought-terminating, dehumanizing cliches to shut the discussion down altogether. After all, why do the work of addressing the issues at hand when endless fighting and finger-pointing is an effective means of manipulating the voting public and keeping one's audience entertained? These elite professional rhetoricians have little motivation to stop using men as their scapegoats and women as their shields. Their hyperbole is contagious, divisive, and damaging to both sexes. Maybe we ought to just build a wall around them.